motion in that. But the ACC's biggest problem is it's a one-team league.
Yeah, and then he did mention that he was proud to work with the Alliance. Of course, that helped the Big Ten.
I think their biggest problem is that 2036 contract. Well, yeah. I mean, that's the biggest problem is the fact that they are locked down for as long as they are. And, yeah, you're right about Clemson's pretty much ran that thing. But, every other league's kind of the same when you look around a little bit.
Who's run the Big Ten?
Ohio State has. Yep. The Pac-12, I'd say Oregon for the most part, although obviously Utah now has a claim to stake there after this past season. But, I mean, regularly, Oregon's been carrying that pail because USC's been down. Washington's kind of been there. I mean, they made the playoff, but that was also a few years ago at this point, and they've been kind of, irrelevant since then, quite frankly. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that's all that uncommon. I think the ACC would be a lot more interesting, and there would be a lot different of tones coming out of that media days if they did not have a 2036 contract hanging over their head. I mean, that's the big albatross.
Yeah, here's one from Jim Phillips. As far as the future, he was asked about the ACC's long TV deal, the grant of rights with ESPN, and he suggested today that ESPN is helping the league with the issue. Quote, they want to help the ACC. They need to help the ACC. That's from the commissioner today in Jim Phillips.
Well, I mean, that's certainly a way to look at it. You would think so. I mean, that's common sense that you've got a 13-year TV deal with somebody. You need the ratings to go up. You need things to be better in the ACC. But also, from the other side of it, if you're ESPN, why would you want to pay them more money if you don't have to?
Craig and I discussed for 20 minutes on Monday's show, back and forth. It was a fantastic discussion. In fact, I got a note about it. We both went back and forth on that. Why would ESPN do that? And then I was kind of giving the reasons, in my opinion, why they would. But going back to that, and Craig, Phillips said the ACC grant of rights confident it will not be challenged. What history has told us about the grant of rights. People talked about Oklahoma and Texas leaving immediately. That's not the case. They'll have to wait until their grant of rights are over. Now, one deal here, they only have to wait 2 or 3 years, or 3 years, if they fill it out to 25. In the ACC, I don't see some of the schools wanting to wait 14 years if, in fact, they feel like they're being left in the dust. And so there's the difference in the term of why Texas and Oklahoma have been, for the most part, you think, pretty patient with what they are letting the clock run out at some point.
Well, yeah, they don't want 3 presidential elections to go by in the time of it where, when Texas and Oklahoma leave, I mean, it's only a couple years from now. So, yeah, you're also not talking about what would be a prodigious amount more money than if you left with 1 year left on the GOR as opposed to 13 years.
Yeah, I mean, if a baby was born today, they're going to be 13, give or take, years old by the time that grant of rights runs out. I mean, think about that. 13 freaking years.
That's might have long 3 or 4 new siblings with them, too, yeah.
That's a long time, man. And so that was my whole point the other day and you started talking about, well, what if they basically – you insinuated front-loading their contract or ramping up the money. My whole point was the length is what's the killer. I mean, the money's the killer too, but the length is like the real killer because you need the money to change, but the length says that it doesn't have to change for over a decade. So that's where I was coming from with why would ESPN help them? They're not going to do it out of the kindness of their heart. That was my point. They're not doing it to just boost these other programs. There would have to be some thing driving them to want to do that. And even then, it still makes little sense to me because, again, you've got them locked down for a certain amount of money that's very favorable to you. Your point was, well, maybe they want to prop them up because they need them more and this and that. And I get that. But if I'm Clemson and I'm North Carolina and I'm whoever else you want to throw in there, Virginia Tech or something, I don't know who would actually be candidates outside of those two, Miami, Florida State, whatever. Okay, the money's good for the next few years, but we're still locked down in this contract, and we're still not getting out of this thing. That's the whole point, is the fact that you're locked down. So, yeah, boost the money with some renegotiated ESPN deal in the near term, but long term, which is what clearly the SEC's been planning, they've been looking long term. The Big Ten's been looking long term. The others have all been looking short term. And this one is actually a long-term decision, but it was the wrong decision because everybody's strapped down for as long as they are.
And ESPN, the one thing about the ACC, and I guess the Pac-12 network, which has been a disaster with ESPN, But one of the things is with ESPN, I believe it is. But the one thing about ACC, they do have their network, and their network, like the SEC, is tied into ESPN. So it's not like they have their contract with ESPN and then they have their tier 3 or whatever you would call that separately with another network.
Well, they can't. The other thing is like, I don't know why ESPN would negotiate against itself.
Well, and Craig, most of the fans feel that way. I just have an inkling that they wouldn't do it just to be nice. They're not going to do it just because you're like your family. It's not going to happen. But there's got to be another reason for them to do that. And there would be a reason that would help their members, the ACC, or their family, but also it would absolutely perhaps free them up as well.
What I would think the only thing that could happen, since you can't have the ACC can't go to Fox, CBS, all these other people right now and try to get a better offer. That's where they're, like Craig said, 13 years at an extreme disadvantage. Now, what could happen, because this isn't their contract, is that Notre Dame could go and say, how much value do we bring to this if we jump in as a football member and we're a full-fledged member of the ACC? And the only reason I would say they would do that to spur in the Big Ten is Notre Dame gets to make their own rules right now, or they get to, and they don't have to follow by anything else. But if they feel they need to be in a conference because TV deals and more media rights and all of that, but they don't want to put up with the headache of having to answer to all the schools in the Big Ten, then they could go to the ACC and say, you're welcome, we're the king now. But I don't really see that happening.
All right, there's a lot going on, as you can imagine, like 5 or 6 different conversations as well with our chat room. We appreciate that. The text line, already got a text from Arizona that's going to ask a question, and we'll answer that for you as well. Then that number is 254-339-1122. Jim Phillips, if we take the path that's only going to be about football and basketball, shame on us. Well, you could actually say you're really taking a path that's only about football, not even basketball, even though that is a very strong revenue sport. And there's another one. On the fear of the Power Fives becoming the Big Two, or Craig calls them the Super Two. All neighborhoods need to be healthy. It's not good for college athletics if we're not. We understand where those 2 leagues are. We are trying to find ways to close that gap. And the problem is, you don't really have too many options to do that. I did speak with somebody today that is a sponsor, tightly wound in with the ACC. He feels as if there is some sort of way that they're going to be able to kind of redo a few things. And he's a sponsor. And he says what's happened, at least from his opinion, is that he feels like some of the sponsors are now blowing back because they feel like there's this arms race at ESPN and Fox. You know, they used to be all like owned by the same thing. But he feels like that there's some sponsors and that they are now starting to get in the ear of the networks and wanting to make sure, hey, slow this down because the money you pay them is coming from us. Just a note, doesn't mean that will slow anybody down.
Yeah, Jim Phillips also said on the 50-50 partnership with ESPN and the ACC network, they're motivated, we're motivated, and we've come together to have some discussions about what would be the next iteration for the ACC. Doesn't mean we're going to make a move, doesn't mean we're not going to move, but all options are on the table, and they're having daily conversations about how to increase revenue for the ACC. So, yeah, I mean, that's all very interesting. I would love to know ultimately what ESPN's ulterior motive is, because there is one, and you know there is one. I mean, they're not just going by the seat of their pants and just like, let's see where this takes us. No, they've been clearly very calculated, as have the other networks, and how this has all gone down. Fox with the LA schools, that wasn't just overnight that occurred. I think there's a lot going on that we're totally unaware of. Most likely, there's probably some things that have leaked out behind those closed doors that we've gotten, whiffs of and have been able to kind of run with and talk about a little bit.